Joining me now is the moderator of NBC's Meet the Press, Kristen Welker, who did the final debate in the last campaign cycle, and an extraordinary debate it was. Plus, senior advisor to President Biden's 2020 campaign, Alencia Johnson, and the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, Michael Steele, host, of course, of MSNBC's The Weekend on Saturday and Sunday mornings. It's so great to have you all. Kristen, you know what those moderators are going through, the knots in their stomach, yes. And you did it with Trump, and it was just incredible, Trump and Biden.
Thank you, Andrea.
Let's talk about how this crisis in the Middle East, this expanding crisis, plus the other problems, the domestic problems, the port strike, the floods, how does all of this affect the White House strategy and the Harris strategy?
It's a great question. First of all, for the debate moderators, I'm envisioning them rewriting some of their questions yes. as we speak, Andrea. Look, let's just take Iran, where you started this broadcast. This is creating an extraordinary and incredibly complicated backdrop for the Harris-Walz campaign because, of course, she is currently in the White House. Just moments ago, former President Donald Trump online posting about how this would never have happened if he were in the Oval Office. Of course, there's absolutely no proof of that. But that's the type of rhetoric, I think, that you will hear from Senator J.D. Vance tonight. And I think it will put an outsized emphasis on foreign policy, both the Trump foreign policy, because he has a record, as well as the Biden-Harris foreign policy. So from Governor Walz's perspective, I'm sure he was prepared to talk about foreign policy regardless, but obviously this reshapes part of the conversation. And Andrea, just zooming out a little bit, for Senator Vance, he has some of the lowest favorability ratings of a vice presidential candidate that we've seen in NBC News polling history. So I think one of his challenges tonight is to not just defend a Trump presidency, but to try to come off as more likable. For Governor Walz, I've been talking to Democrats who are a little jittery because he hasn't been out front and center. He hasn't done a whole lot of media interviews, and they know that Vance can be strong on the debate stage. Can Walz counter that in a succinct, compelling way, particularly given all of these new developments that you and I are discussing?
And Alencia, from a Democratic strategy standpoint, Tim Walz will not get fact-checking from the moderators as the ABC moderators did in that debate. So what does he do? Does he become the fact-checker-in-chief and slow everything down and start arguing over cats and dogs and other lies that have been spoken? Does he stick to his strategy? How does he handle immigration? And he doesn't have a foreign policy background. He was in the military, obviously, for 23 years, but not in a policy-making role. Neither does J.D. Vance, of course.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the piece, right? J.D. Vance doesn't have this experience that he's going to try to pin against Walz. But I do think, to the point that Governor Walz will have to do some fact-checking. He has been out here even before he was the vice presidential nominee. He has actually been out here talking about their record and the lies coming out of the Trump campaign, right? That's part of the reason a lot of us knew who he was. He was calling them out directly for their lies and for the rhetoric. And so I don't doubt that he will have that ability to do that in a quick, succinct way, while also talking about his plans to support President Harris, as well as their plans to fix a lot of the issues that, quite frankly, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance want to continue to, make a fuss around, but actually won't put forward any solutions. I think he will continue to paint this vision of America moving forward on a host of issues. And so I actually think that he will be able to manage both doing fact-checking as well as talking about this that Walz have.
And Michael, Tim Walz was chosen because he's Coach Walz. He's Minnesota nice. Mm-hmm. So I guess he can be tougher tonight. But what about J.D. Vance? He has such a low favorability, the lowest favorability rating of the four candidates, one of the least liked running mates in the last 30 years. Kristen was just pointing that out. So how tough can he be? How sharp-edged? Or does he have to try to soften the edges? And, and finally, as you know very well, he's got an audience of one. He is performing for Donald J. Trump. And Donald J. Trump wants to see an aggressive defender of the Trump record.
Yeah, look, they're not worried about his favorability. Donald Trump could care less about J.D. Vance's favorability. The only favorability he cares about is his own. And so J.D. Vance has one goal and one mission tonight, and that is to make Donald Trump continue to like him. And not second guess, as he already has, picking him for vice president. So I expect him to come out strong. I expect him to come out hard. He is very good at the bait and shift. If you go back and you look at some of his debates for his U.S. Senate campaign, he is very good at setting up the lie and shifting off of it and diverting to something else. So I think for Tim Walz, basically the only fact checking he has to do go, that's a lie, and move on. Because he can't go down that rabbit hole of explaining every lie that's going to come out of J.D. Vance's mouth. Hang his comments about women around his neck, his ankle, his arm at every chance you can. Not just about abortion, but about women having control over their economies, having control over how they raise their families, having control on their roles in our society as leaders in the future. So there's a lot that both of these gentlemen will have to do, but their missions are very different. J.D. Vance's mission is whatever Donald Trump wants, and that is to play to that one person. I think Tim Walz's mission is to continue to advance the agenda and the nature of the Harris campaign, which is looking forward and moving the country forward, not going backwards into Trump.
And Kristen, healthcare is likely to become a big issue as well tonight. There are some domestic issues, and those are the issues: the economy, immigration, obviously, but healthcare is a big economic issue for most Americans now.
Absolutely.
It's such a huge cost.
Yeah, and think about what happened during the debate between Donald Trump and Vice President Harris. He talked about the fact that they have basically contours of a plan coming together to replace Obamacare. He ran back in 2016 on a promise to repeal and replace Obamacare. Never did that. And so I actually pressed J.D. Vance on what is the plan? And there was no clear answer. So I think that will be in the spotlight, particularly in the context of this post-Roe era, Andrea, and the fact that there have been a range of different statements put forth by former President Donald Trump as it relates to reproductive rights. I think that Walz will try to put that in focus, and that will be an area where he will highlight. And I'm also told that he is being advised, look, highlight all of those moments when Senator Vance criticized former President Trump. Keep that in focus so that the audience remembers just how big of a shift it is that Walz is running with Donald Trump in the first place. And one more point, Andrea, when you think about what's the importance of a vice presidential debate, I would argue this vice presidential debate takes on a whole new meaning simply because there is no second debate scheduled right now between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. This could be the final word, effectively, of the campaign, the beginning of the closing arguments, if you will.